He ordered movers for his $1 million home, but when two little boys showed up carrying boxes, his entire past came crashing back. The morning was crisp, with a soft breeze rolling over the hills as Robert Harper pulled up to the driveway of his newly built estate. Everything about the house gleamed with precision and modern elegance, clean lines, glass railings, and a minimalist charm that spoke of status, wealth, and meticulous taste. Robert, dressed in a tailored light suit that perfectly complemented his deep blue eyes and dark hair, stepped out of his car with a sense of pride and expectation. This home was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, something cleaner, simpler, a reward for years of sacrifice and relentless pursuit of success. He checked his watch and glanced toward the street, expecting to see a team of professional movers arrive in one of the company trucks he had hired. But instead, what approached made him take a step forward and narrow his eyes in disbelief. Two small boys, no older than 7, were walking toward the driveway. They wore identical navy blue coveralls over slightly dirty white t-shirts. On their heads were matching blue baseball caps, pulled low over their brows, but even from a distance, Robert could see their eyes. They were a light, piercing blue, oddly familiar. Each boy carried a large cardboard box, arms strained slightly under the weight, but neither of them hesitated or complained. They moved with quiet determination, like boys who had done this before and had no intention of slowing down. Robert walked toward them quickly, disbelief giving way to concern. When they set the boxes down on the stone pathway with care and prepared to go back for more, he stepped in front of them. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying not to sound harsh but unable to hide the edge in his voice. "These boxes are heavy. You're just kids." One of the boys looked up at him with steady, clear eyes and replied, "We're working. Our mom is sick. We need to earn money." The answer hit him like a jolt. Robert stared at them, heart stuttering slightly, unsure of what to say. There was no adult in sight. No supervisor, no moving truck, just these two small boys, lifting and carrying items clearly not meant for children. Their faces were flushed, but they didn't seem scared or desperate. Only focused. Prepared. "Where are the movers?" he asked more to himself than to them. "We came instead," said the smaller boy. "Please don't send us away. We can finish the job." Robert was struck by the way they spoke, respectful, but too mature for their age. He crouched down, eye level now, and asked gently, "Where's your mother?" The older one hesitated, then answered, "She's at home. She doesn't know we're doing this." "What do you mean she doesn't know?" "She's sick. She sleeps a lot. She thinks we're out with friends, but we wanted to help. We need money for food, for medicine." Something inside Robert began to unravel. He was a man used to logic, structure, clarity, but in that moment, nothing made sense. These children didn't belong here, carrying furniture into a millionaire's home. And yet, here they were, doing it with more integrity and courage than most adults he knew. "Where do you live?" he asked. "In the neighborhood." "Not far," the smaller one said, suddenly looking wary. Robert stood up, his voice firm but calm. "I want you to take me there." They looked at each other, a silent exchange passing between them. Finally, they nodded. The older boy picked up his box again, not because he was told to, but because he didn't want to leave anything unfinished. Robert gently took it from him, and the boy let go with hesitation. They led him down the hill, past the wealthy homes and pristine lawns, until the pavement turned to cracked asphalt and the fences lost their polish. What waited at the end of that short walk would change everything Robert thought he knew about the past, about himself, and about what it meant to truly start over. The boys led Robert down a narrow side street lined with aging homes and neglected front yards. The neighborhood stood in stark contrast to the modern estate he had just left behind. There were rusted fences, chipped paint, and sagging porches with broken steps. Yet the boys walked with quiet familiarity, clearly used to every uneven sidewalk and creaky gate they passed. Robert followed closely, carrying the box one of them had been holding, still trying to process the surreal shift in his day. Less than an hour ago, he was mentally planning where to place his designer couch and which hallway to hang his art collection in. Now he was walking through a rundown neighborhood behind two small children he had never met, toward a house that seemed to hold answers he hadn't known he was looking for. They stopped in front of a one-story house with weathered siding and a screen door that hung crookedly on one hinge. The front yard was littered with a few forgotten toys and a broken tricycle. There was a thin curtain drawn tightly across the window, and the mailbox leaned to one side, stuffed with unopened letters. The older boy pulled out a key from under a flower pot and opened the front door quietly, glancing back at Robert as if to silently ask him not to make noise. The air inside was warm but stale, heavy with the scent of medicine, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old flowers. The living room was small, cramped with second-hand furniture and an old TV balanced on a stack of crates. A few dishes sat in the sink in the attached kitchen, and there were crayons scattered on the coffee table along with a stack of wrinkled papers, drawings, Robert realized, some of them crumpled, others colored carefully in bright reds and blues. The boys motioned for him to follow them down the short hallway. They stopped in front of a bedroom door that was partially ajar. The older one pushed it open just enough for them to slip inside, and Robert stepped in after them, his heartbeat strangely loud in his ears. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a small lamp in the corner. On the bed lay a woman, thin, pale, and unmoving. Her breathing was shallow, and she seemed lost in a restless sleep. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, and there were prescription bottles lined up neatly on the nightstand. The sight of her stopped Robert cold. His throat tightened as he stepped closer. He recognized her instantly. It was Sophie. He hadn't seen her in over 7 years, but her face was etched into his memory as sharply as ever. She looked different now, worn down by time and illness, but her features hadn't changed. The curve of her lips, the line of her brow, the same soft wave in her dark hair. His breath caught in his chest, and he stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Sophie. The woman he had once loved. The woman he had left. He didn't speak, afraid that even the sound of his voice might shatter the fragile quiet in the room. He turned slowly to the boys, and suddenly the pieces started falling into place. The blue eyes. The dark hair. The shape of their faces. They weren't just familiar, they were his. His blood. His children. He felt dizzy, like the air had been pulled from the room. His knees buckled slightly, and he sat down on the edge of the nearby chair without thinking. The older boy stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the silence, and spoke carefully. She's been sick for a while. She gets dizzy. Sometimes she sleeps all day. We try not to bother her. Robert stared at him, barely able to speak. What are your names? I'm Joshua, the boy said. He's Lucas. Robert felt those names hit him like thunder. Sophie used to say if they ever had kids, she liked the name Joshua. He had brushed it off at the time. It had felt like fantasy. Like a conversation that didn't belong in the fast-moving world of deals, deadlines, and ambition. And now, standing in front of him, was the boy she had dreamed of, with his name. Does she know? He asked, barely able to get the words out. Does your mom know you're doing this? Working? Carrying boxes? Lucas shook his head. No. We don't want her to worry. Robert rubbed his face with his hands, trying to catch up to what was happening. His mind was racing with questions, guilt, disbelief. He hadn't known. He hadn't even suspected. Sophie had vanished from his life quietly, completely. And he had let her go, thinking she had chosen silence. He had never imagined she was carrying not one, but 2 new lives inside her. His sons. He stood slowly and approached the bed, looking down at Sophie with 1,000 things he wanted to say, none of which would undo the years of absence. She stirred slightly, her brows twitching as if caught in a half-dream, but she didn't wake. He turned back to the boys, swallowing hard. "Do you have food? Heat? Do you go to school?" Joshua nodded. "Most days. Sometimes we miss if Mom's too sick to walk us." Robert closed his eyes for a moment and steadied himself. His entire world had shifted in the space of 10 minutes. He had thought today would be about furniture and floor plans. But it had become the day he met his sons for the first time, and found the woman he should never have left. And now, whether he was ready or not, he knew he couldn't walk away again. Robert didn't sleep that night. He returned to his new, pristine house, but it felt hollow, like an empty shell he had decorated for someone who no longer existed. He sat on the edge of his luxury mattress in silence, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had just unraveled. The discovery of Sophie and the boys had shaken him more deeply than he could admit, even to himself. For years, he had convinced himself that walking away from that relationship had been necessary, an unfortunate but logical decision. He had wanted to succeed, to build something great, to reach the top without anything holding him back. He had told himself Sophie deserved better than the half-attention of a man married to his career. But now he realized the truth wasn't as noble. He hadn't left because she deserved better, he had left because he had been afraid. Afraid of permanence. Afraid of responsibility. Afraid of the life he had now stumbled into without warning. That morning, as sunlight crept through the tall windows of his new home, Robert didn't prepare for meetings or check his emails like usual. Instead, he drove to a grocery store, filled 2 carts with food, toiletries, and a few small toys, and returned to the boys' neighborhood. When he knocked on the door, Joshua opened it, still in pajamas, his expression unreadable but not surprised. Robert stepped inside and gently handed him a warm bag with breakfast sandwiches and orange juice. The boy took it quietly and walked it to the kitchen without asking questions. Lucas peeked from behind a doorway, his hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep. Sophie was awake this time. She was sitting up in bed with a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale and tired but alert. When she saw Robert in the doorway, she stiffened. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rough from sleep and emotion. Robert stepped into the room slowly. "I know. But I couldn't not come." She glanced toward the hallway. "Did they tell you everything?" "Enough," he said. "Enough to realize I have 2 sons I've never known. Enough to see that I left more behind than I ever imagined." Sophie sighed and looked down at her hands. "I didn't tell you because I thought you didn't want to be part of anything that wasn't on your terms. I figured if you wanted to come back, you would have. But you didn't." "I didn't know," he admitted. "If I had, I..." She looked up sharply. "You don't get to rewrite the past, Robert. You left. That's what you chose." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words. "You're right. I did. And it was the worst decision I ever made. But I'm not here to rewrite anything. I'm here because I want to help now. I want to be here now." Sophie's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained cautious. "Why now? Guilt? Charity?" "No," he said quietly. "Because I walked into that house yesterday expecting furniture and ended up finding a family I didn't know I had. And now I can't go back to pretending I'm alone in this world." She closed her eyes, as if the weight of his words was too much to hold. After a moment, she said, "I can't rely on someone who might disappear again. Not for me, and definitely not for them. They've been through too much already." "I understand," Robert said. "That's why I'm not asking for your trust right away. I'm just asking for a chance to earn it." Later that day, he stayed. He cooked lunch with what little they had in the kitchen, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, and swept the leaves from the front steps. He didn't do it for show. He didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because he wanted to understand what their lives had been like and where, if possible, he could fit into them now. The boys began to warm to him in subtle ways. Lucas followed him around the house, mimicking his movements. Joshua started asking questions, first about Robert's car, then about where he worked, and finally, about what kind of dad he thought he would be. Robert didn't have answers yet. But he gave them his attention, which, he was starting to realize, was something he had withheld from nearly everyone in his life. When evening came, he offered to stay and read to them. They brought out a tattered storybook, one he recognized from his own childhood. He sat between them on the worn-out couch, his voice steady, his heart unexpectedly full. Sophie watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, but her expression was no longer hard. It was tired, yes, but also touched by something fragile. Something that looked almost like hope. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Robert lingered at the door. Sophie walked him out, holding her sweater close against the evening chill. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But I want to." She studied him for a long moment. "Don't make them promises. Just be there." "I will," he said, and for the first time in years, he truly meant it. The days that followed fell into a fragile but steady rhythm, as if the universe itself was cautiously watching to see what Robert would do next. Each morning, instead of driving to meetings or boardrooms, Robert found himself pulling up to the modest house in the quiet neighborhood that had suddenly become more real to him than anything money had ever bought. He didn't arrive with grand gestures or promises. He brought breakfast some mornings, helped with homework in the afternoons, and fixed the broken curtain rods and squeaky door hinges in between. It was strange how quickly he adapted to a life so far removed from the world of marble floors and catered dinners. What surprised him more was how natural it felt. There was no press, no schedule, no performance, just the slow, uncertain process of being present. Joshua and Lucas were still cautious, though they no longer flinched when he entered a room. They asked more questions, sought his attention, and began testing his patience in subtle ways, as children often do when trying to gauge the limits of trust. Lucas once knocked over a glass of juice and waited to be yelled at. Robert simply cleaned it up with a towel and asked him if he was okay. That moment changed something between them. Joshua challenged Robert to a game of chess and grinned when he won, telling him, "You're not bad, for someone who probably hasn't played in years." They were still testing, still measuring. But with every small gesture, every quiet afternoon spent at the kitchen table or in the backyard throwing a ball, they allowed him just a little more space in their lives. Sophie watched from a distance. She had grown thinner from the illness, her cheeks a little sunken, but her eyes had gained a clarity Robert hadn't seen in years. She didn't speak much about the past, and Robert didn't push. They lived in the present now, as if acknowledging too much of what had been would collapse the fragile structure they were trying to rebuild. Occasionally, their conversations would drift into deeper waters, quiet, guarded exchanges about what went wrong, what they had wanted, what they had feared. But mostly, they focused on the boys, their routines, their needs, and the moments that felt the most real. One afternoon, Robert arrived with a small box wrapped in brown paper. It wasn't expensive. Inside were 2 matching backpacks, the boys' names embroidered on them. Lucas tore into his first and shouted with delight. Joshua examined his more carefully, but the way he held it said more than words could. Sophie raised an eyebrow when she saw them but didn't say anything until later, when the boys were outside playing. "You're doing a lot," she said as she leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "More than I expected." "I'm not trying to win you over with things," Robert said. "I just want to be useful." "It's not about the backpacks," she said quietly. "It's about how they look at you. They're starting to believe again. That's a big thing to carry." Robert looked down, his voice low. "I know. I carry it with both hands." That night, as he was getting ready to leave, Sophie stopped him at the door. "Are you serious about staying involved?" Even when things get complicated? He looked at her, surprised by the question. Yes. Even then. Especially then. She studied him for a long time, then nodded. Then maybe we should talk about long-term things. Legal things. He understood what she meant. Shared custody. Medical decisions. School forms. The logistics of parenthood that don't come with fanfare but hold more weight than most vows. And just like that, the door opened a little wider. The next morning, he called his lawyer. Not because he wanted control, but because he wanted recognition. He wanted the law to reflect what his heart had already accepted, that those boys were his sons, not just by blood, but by choice. By presence. By love. As December neared, the house began to change. It wasn't sudden. But there were signs. Sophie started smiling more. The boys began leaving their drawings on the fridge instead of hiding them away. A small artificial Christmas tree appeared in the corner of the living room. There was no discussion about it, no ceremony, just Lucas saying, "We should have won this year," and Robert returning an hour later with a box full of lights and ornaments. The four of them decorated it together, in the soft glow of evening. Music played low from an old radio. Robert held Lucas up to hang the star at the top while Joshua arranged presents beneath it, two of which were carefully wrapped packages Robert had seen them hide earlier that day. Later, Sophie sat on the couch, her feet curled beneath her, watching the boys play. "You know," she said, almost as if to herself, "I never thought we'd have a tree again." Robert didn't reply right away. He just sat beside her and watched the blinking lights reflect in the boys' eyes. "Neither did I," he finally said. "But I'm glad we do." Winter settled in slowly, bringing with it colder mornings, shorter days, and a new layer of quiet in the neighborhood where Sophie and the boys lived. The house remained modest and worn, but something within its walls had changed. The energy felt different now, less heavy, more alive. Robert became part of that atmosphere, not as a visitor, but as someone slowly weaving himself into the fabric of their everyday life. It wasn't something anyone officially declared. It simply happened. He showed up before school to help make breakfast or drive the boys when Sophie was too tired. He stayed late some nights when the heater made strange noises or when Lucas had a nightmare. He didn't try to take over, didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just stayed. Consistently. Quietly. One particularly cold evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table while Robert helped the boys with a science project on the floor. They were building a model of the solar system using foam balls and a lot of messy glue. Lucas kept asking why Pluto didn't count anymore, and Joshua, ever the older brother, insisted that science changed its mind. Sophie watched them for a long time, resting her cheek against her palm. The image in front of her felt surreal, two sons and their father, together, laughing, arguing, making something from nothing. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe it could last. After the boys went to bed, Sophie offered Robert a cup of tea, and they sat in the small living room under a blanket that was too thin for winter but familiar. The light from the tree blinked softly in the corner, and a radio hummed faintly in the background. For a while, they didn't talk. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every gap with explanation. Eventually, Sophie broke it. "I used to imagine this," she said, staring at her mug. "Not the exact moment, not the house or the tree. Just, this feeling. You being here. The boys not having to carry everything alone." Robert turned toward her. "I wish I had come sooner. If I'd known." She shook her head gently. "You didn't know. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe we weren't ready back then. I was angry for a long time, but now. I'm just grateful. Grateful they have you. Grateful I don't have to do this alone anymore." Her voice cracked a little at the end, and she quickly took a sip of tea to hide it. Robert didn't reach for her hand or say anything comforting. He just stayed next to her, quiet and steady. That, he had learned, meant more to Sophie than any apology or promise. A few days later, Sophie's health took a dip. It wasn't life-threatening, but she became weaker, more fatigued. The doctor warned it could be a recurring condition, something she'd need long-term management for. She took the news quietly, nodding, asking all the right questions, but Robert could see the fear beneath the calm. When they got home, she tried to pretend nothing had changed. She made dinner, helped with homework, folded laundry. But he saw the way her hands trembled, how her breath shortened when she bent to pick something up. One night, after the boys were asleep, she sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor. What if I can't do this? What if I get worse? Robert knelt in front of her. Then we adjust. We get help. We lean on each other. She met his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she let him see how scared she was. I've always had to be the strong one. I don't know how to stop. You don't have to stop being strong, he said. You just don't have to be strong alone. In the days that followed, he took on more. He arranged for a part-time nurse to check in weekly, signed up the boys for after-school programs, and started preparing meals with Lucas, who had quickly declared himself sous chef. The boys noticed the change, but they didn't ask questions. They simply adapted, and that said more about the kind of resilience they had learned growing up than anything else. As Christmas approached, Robert suggested they spend it together in his house. It was larger, warmer, with more space for the boys to run around. Sophie hesitated, not because she didn't want to go, but because the idea of stepping into Robert's new life felt like crossing an invisible line, one she wasn't sure she belonged on. But Joshua was the one who decided for all of them. I want us to all be together, he said simply. Like a real family. So they packed up a few bags, bundled into the car, and drove through softly falling snow to the house on the hill, the house that had once been just a symbol of Robert's ambition but now stood as a beacon for something much greater. That Christmas morning, the boys tore open gifts in front of a roaring fire, their faces lit with excitement and joy. Sophie watched from the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Robert stood nearby, coffee in hand, not saying much. He didn't need to. The boys' laughter, the warmth of the room, the sound of music playing low in the background, it all said enough. Later, as they sat down to eat a meal they had cooked together, Sophie looked at Robert and, without any ceremony or build-up, simply said, "Thank you." He looked back at her and replied, "You don't need to thank me. I'm home now. And I'm staying." The days after Christmas felt suspended in a quiet kind of magic. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the hills around Robert's house in soft white, and the world outside seemed to slow down. Inside, the warmth of something deeper had begun to take root, routine, familiarity, and a sense of peace that none of them had realized they'd been craving for years. The house, once a cold symbol of Robert's success, now felt lived in. There were mismatched socks by the fireplace, empty mugs left on side tables, stray Lego bricks underfoot. Joshua and Lucas no longer knocked on Robert's door before entering his office, they just burst in with drawings or questions or stories. And Robert welcomed every interruption with a smile that had become less practiced and more genuine. Sophie was still recovering, her strength returning in waves rather than a steady climb, but her laughter was easier now, and the tiredness in her eyes was replaced by something much softer, acceptance, maybe even hope. She started painting again, using a small corner of Robert's home office, which he cleared without hesitation the moment she mentioned wanting a space of her own. He bought her new brushes, canvases, and oils, then left her to it, never hovering. She would lose herself in color for hours, and when she emerged, she was lighter somehow, as though the weight of the past was being drained through the tips of her fingers and onto the canvas. One morning, while Lucas was upstairs working on a school project and Joshua was reading on the rug, Sophie and Robert found themselves alone in the kitchen, the quiet between them gentle and full. She leaned against the counter with a cup of tea while he dried dishes. It felt natural. Domestic. Something unremarkable and yet deeply important. "I've been thinking," Sophie said after a moment. Robert looked over, eyebrows slightly raised. "About? About the boys. About us. About what comes next." He set the dish towel down and turned to face her fully, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "They need stability," she continued. "Not just now, but going forward. If something happens to me, if I can't." He stepped closer before she could finish the sentence. "Don't talk like that. You're getting better." "I am. But life doesn't always ask what we're ready for. We have to plan. I've started speaking with a family attorney about formalizing your rights. Joint custody. Shared guardianship. Something legal and lasting. If you're still willing." His answer came without hesitation. "Yes. Of course, I am." "It's not just paperwork, Robert," she said. "It's a commitment. Not just to them, but to being part of a life that's messy and unpredictable and sometimes exhausting." He gave her a small, knowing smile. "That's the only kind of life I want now." The legal process began that week. Robert's lawyer, surprised but respectful, worked quickly. Sophie was cautious but thorough. They didn't rush it, and they didn't make it dramatic. There were no long speeches or emotional declarations, just signatures, conversations, and quiet understanding. When the paperwork was finally signed and filed, Robert sat in the car outside the courthouse, holding the final copy in his hands. It wasn't just a document. It was a bridge, one built slowly, carefully, from the wreckage of their past towards something steady and real. Joshua and Lucas didn't fully understand what had changed, but they sensed the difference. They felt it in the way Robert now answered calls from their school. In how he helped with dentist appointments. In how his name began appearing on permission slips. More importantly, they saw it in how their mother looked at him, with trust. One weekend, after the papers were finalized, they went sledding together at a nearby park. The boys raced down icy hills while Robert and Sophie stood at the bottom, laughing and catching their breath. Lucas ran up to Robert and grabbed his hand without thinking, tugging him toward the sled. "Your turn, Dad." The word hung in the air for a second. Robert hadn't heard it before from either of them, at least not like that. But Lucas said it easily, naturally, as though it had always belonged to him. Robert looked at Sophie, who nodded, her eyes glassy but smiling. He climbed onto the sled with Lucas and, for a moment, felt more weightless than the snowflakes falling around them. Later that evening, as the fireplace crackled and the boys played a board game on the floor, Robert sat beside Sophie on the couch. She leaned her head on his shoulder, something she hadn't done in years, and they watched the fire together. "You're not just a guest in this life anymore," she said softly. "You're part of it now." "I know," he replied. "And I never want to leave it again." The house was quiet except for the muffled sound of children's laughter and the settling creaks of a home full of life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, everything felt warm and steady. They didn't need to say what they already knew, that something beautiful had taken root, born from something broken, rebuilt by presence, patience, and love. Spring arrived not with grand fanfare but gradually, with sunlight lasting a little longer each evening and the wind no longer biting at their faces during early morning walks. The snow had melted into memory, and the trees outside Robert's house began to blossom with fragile pink buds. There was something symbolic about the season this year, something more than warmth or flowers. It felt like confirmation that everything they had been trying to build was finally beginning to hold its shape. Life, still imperfect and filled with unpredictable rhythms, had settled into something steady. The boys had become completely comfortable in Robert's presence. Joshua no longer hesitated before asking for help with his science homework, and Lucas had developed the habit of crawling into Robert's lap without warning during family movie nights. There were still the usual tantrums and sibling squabbles, the occasional burst of energy that left the living room looking like a storm had passed through it. But there was laughter, loud and honest, filling the house with sounds it had never known before. For Robert, those ordinary sounds were now the most extraordinary thing in his life. Sophie had regained more of her strength. The treatments had been working slowly, her health stabilizing with rest, care, and the security that she was no longer carrying everything alone. She had even reopened a small online art shop, selling prints of her paintings. Robert had insisted she set up a proper space in his home, now their shared home. He converted the sunroom into a studio, where soft light streamed through large windows and turned her canvases into portals. Her hands, once trembling from exhaustion, now moved confidently with brushes, blending color into emotion. It had become her sanctuary. And whenever he watched her paint, he felt both awe and regret for all the years he had missed, awe that she still allowed him to stand beside her now. They had not spoken about love, not directly. There had been no dramatic confessions, no romantic promises whispered late at night. What had grown between them came from presence, not performance. One evening, while folding laundry side by side, Sophie looked over and said, "It doesn't feel like you're visiting anymore. It feels like you live here." Robert had smiled gently. "That's because I do." The legal transition had passed quietly, but it had altered everything. Robert was now listed as emergency contact at school, on medical forms, at summer camp registration. More importantly, he was a father in the boys' eyes, not a visitor or a helper, but a fixture. A man they expected to see when they woke up and when they fell asleep. One day, while waiting in line for snow cones at the park, a stranger asked Lucas if he was with his dad. Without hesitation, Lucas pointed at Robert and said, "That's him," as casually as if it had always been true. Robert had walked home from that moment with a lump in his throat. The change was clear not only in Robert, but in how the world responded to him. His work had shifted too. He still ran his company, but his priorities had been quietly rewritten. He stopped taking evening calls when the boys had school projects. He declined business dinners that overlapped with family time. He brought Lucas to "take your kid to work" day, and let him sit in the CEO chair, watching the boy pretend to sign million-dollar contracts with crayon in hand. Joshua had spent a full afternoon in the office library, asking about charts and market strategy, trying to sound like a grown-up. Robert had never felt more fulfilled in a meeting than he had that day. One afternoon, after the boys had gone to a neighbor's birthday party and Sophie had stayed behind to finish a painting, Robert stepped out onto the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. The air smelled like wet earth and blossoms. He handed her a mug and sat beside her on the swing bench. They didn't speak for several minutes. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for explanation. Then she said, very simply, "You've changed." Robert didn't answer right away. He let her words settle in. Then he said, "I don't think I changed. I think I finally became the version of myself I was supposed to be all along." She looked at him for a long time, and then reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I see him. And I'm glad you found him." That night, the boys returned sticky and tired from the party, collapsing into bed with barely a protest. Robert and Sophie stayed up late talking, not just about the kids or the day, but about their memories, their regrets, and even their dreams. There was no longer a wall between past and present. There was space now, shared honestly, with no pressure to define what came next. But Robert knew what he wanted. He didn't say it yet. He didn't need to. Not in words. Instead, he showed it in how he woke up early to make Sophie tea when she had a headache. In how he carried Lucas to bed even when the boy insisted he was too big for that now. In how he stood quietly behind Sophie when she painted, just close enough for her to feel he was there. Spring was the season of beginnings, yes, but for them, it wasn't about starting over. It was about continuing forward, hand in hand, with nothing hidden and nothing rushed. And for the first time in Robert's life, continuing forward felt better than any finish line. Summer arrived with a quiet sense of triumph. The air was warmer, the skies clearer, and the days longer, filled with the kind of golden light that made everything seem a little softer, a little more hopeful. For the first time in years, Robert felt as if he could breathe deeply without the constant weight of pressure on his chest. It wasn't that life had become easy, there were still bills to pay, calls to return, unexpected colds, missed appointments, and the usual chaos of parenting two energetic boys. But there was peace now, a rhythm to it all, and something inside him had settled in a way it never had before. The boys were out of school, and the house was alive with energy. Mornings began with cereal spilled on the floor, animated arguments about who got to use the blue bowl, and last-minute plans for picnics or bike rides. Joshua had taken up reading novels far above his age level and liked to recite facts about space or historical wars over breakfast. Lucas, meanwhile, was determined to build the world's longest domino line and insisted on using every flat surface in the house as part of his construction. Robert found himself constantly navigating between awe and exhaustion, often laughing in disbelief at the beautiful mess his life had become. Sophie had grown stronger with the change of seasons. Her health had stabilized enough that she began painting for hours each day, her work more vibrant and expressive than ever. One afternoon, Robert walked into her studio and saw a new canvas leaning against the wall. It showed two boys playing in a field under a wide sky, with a man watching nearby, not posed or central, just present, quietly a part of their world. Robert recognized the scene instantly. It was them. But it wasn't a painting of reality, it was one of peace, of wholeness, of family as it should be. He said nothing, only walked over and kissed her forehead, letting the moment speak for itself. By midsummer, Robert had made a decision. It hadn't come all at once, but gradually, as each day unfolded and showed him what truly mattered. He planned everything carefully, without flash, without extravagance. He wanted it to be quiet, honest, and entirely theirs. One warm evening, while the boys were at a weekend sleepover with friends, Robert invited Sophie to the porch. Lanterns glowed softly around them, and a breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the air. They sat side by side, barefoot, sipping iced tea and talking about nothing and everything. Then Robert stood, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box, not because it was traditional, but because it was symbolic, something that had waited far too long. He knelt, not to impress or perform, but because it felt right. "I don't want to go back to how we were before," he said. "I don't want to fix something broken. I want to keep building what we've started. With you. With the boys. Not because I think it will be perfect, but because I know now that it doesn't have to be. I love this life. I love you. Will you marry me?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She stared at him for a long moment, then reached out, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had come before. She nodded, slowly at first, then with more certainty. "Yes," she said. "But only if you keep doing the dishes." They both laughed, and Robert stood, wrapping his arms around her as she leaned into him, their hearts full with the quiet kind of joy that doesn't need an audience. When the boys returned the next morning, Lucas noticed Sophie's ring immediately and gasped so loudly he nearly fell over. Joshua, trying to play it cool, nodded in approval but couldn't hide his smile. That night, they all sat together on the couch, watching an old movie, a blanket thrown over them like a tent, popcorn spilling everywhere. There were no fireworks, no speeches, no perfect ending. Just family. Just love. Just the ordinary miracle of people who had once been broken finding each other again, and choosing, every day, to stay. And that was more than enough. This story, at its heart, is about redemption, not the grand, cinematic kind, but the quiet, earned kind that happens slowly, over dishes washed, homework helped with, and silence shared. What makes the ending powerful isn't the proposal or the legal papers, it's the fact that a man who once ran from responsibility learned how to stay. The boys didn't just gain a father, they gained proof that people can change. Sophie didn't just accept him back, she chose to believe in a future that wasn't guaranteed. And Robert didn't just fix what was broken, he built something new, stronger because of the cracks. The ending isn't a fairy tale. It's something rarer, honest, hopeful, and deeply human.